Hello, and welcome to our panel today. My name is Anna Swanson, and I'm the trade reporter for the New York Times. I'm pleased to moderate this event. This panel today will examine a question that's really vital for the worldwide response to coronavirus. Is globalization a threat or an opportunity when dealing with the current pandemic and other future crises? We know that coronavirus has kicked off a scramble worldwide for supplies like protective masks, testing equipment, and other medical goods, resulting in trade barriers and tensions that are only likely to continue as a vaccine comes to fruition. Our panelists today will speak about the trade-offs, dilemmas, and challenges involved as countries seek to protect their citizens from coronavirus, but try to avoid being protectionist. We'll have about an hour for a presentation and 30 minutes for audience discussion. So we welcome questions from the audience, which you can submit in the chat function. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Oscar Guinea, a senior economist at the European Center for International Political Economy, Annabelle Gonzalez, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Lucien Chernot, the head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and International Procurement Negotiations for the European Commission and their former chief trade economist. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Oscar to begin today.
Politicians calling for reshoring. And so, for instance, we have President Emmanuel Macron, who says that we are overly reliant on supply chains. We have the Commissioner for the Internal Market, Thierry Breton, who said that globalization has gone too far. And even Angela Merkel said that Europe should build its own strategic capabilities, which in other words is to say that Europe should produce some of these goods within its own borders. And you have similar comments in the other side of the Atlantic as well. But why is that? Well, I think part of the reason is because a number of countries found themselves unable to produce enough medical supplies and medical equipment in the first wave of the pandemic. And then supply chains and globalization has been blamed for that. But it is really globalization to blame for the shortage of medical goods? I would say no, and I'm going to give you 3 reasons for that. The first one is that no country, I believe, could have faced the increase in domestic demand on their own. Not even China, who is one of the largest producers of face masks, could produce enough face masks for their own population in the beginning of January and had to ask for urgent imports from the EU, for instance. And you know, the idea of producing all the medical goods yourself as one country is, from my point of view, unrealistic. Let me give you the example of a ventilator. It's been quite widely used in the online. So a ventilator has around 500 critical components. These components are produced, assembled, designed in different countries across the world. If you were to produce a ventilator yourself, you will have to replicate the supply chain of 500 critical components. That's quite a task, and it will be expensive. And I think this is the third reason why I think we shouldn't blame globalization for the shortage of medical goods. But even if you manage to produce some of these goods yourself, it will be costly. So the OECD has published a study that says that if some of the supply chain are substituted by domestic goods, the world will become poorer and more vulnerable to shocks. And it's not just the cost of it, it's also the opportunity, because what globalization allows you is to use your resources, which are usually scarce, to produce things that you're good at. And let me finish this point with two ideas. The first one is that we're putting quite a lot of hopes on globalization to end COVID-19. And this is the vaccine. You have scientists and researchers across the world doing work on finding the vaccine, finding better ways to test for COVID, and finding ways to alleviate the illness. And this is labor specialization. This is the sharing of ideas and the sharing of evidence and information. So in a way, in the most pessimistic scenario, we'll have like a vaccine in 2-3 years. You can compare that with polio. Polio has been eradicated in Africa this year. The first cases of polio came in the early 20th century, and it was not until 1960 that a vaccine was actually approved in the US. So that took 60 years. And on the whole, globalization has actually, or supply chains have actually delivered. There is no longer shortages of medical goods in the sense that businesses across the world have managed to ramp up production despite quite a heavy restrictions on supply and transport. So these are the ideas where I think if I will have to answer the first question of my presentation that I should have put before, is globalization a force for good? I would say that I think so. The second question that I would like to address in my presentation is, did countries turn inwards or outwards? So I would say that, and I'm going to put this slide first, I would say that it was a mix of both. So countries kind of follow a dual strategy. They reduce the trade barriers to get as many medical supplies as possible, and then they put export restrictions to avoid some of these goods getting out of the countries. So if you count the number of measures that countries enact between January and July, and you divide them between trade restrictive measures, those who hinder trade, and trade liberalizing measures, those that promote trade, you will find that there were more trade restrictive measures. These are the vertical bars in the chart. However, if you look at the measures that are active, the measures that continue to apply between January and July, then you find the opposite, that there were more trade liberalizing measures than trade restrictive ones. And why is that the case? I think the case is because trade restrictive measures don't get along very well with supply chain. So in a way, you are restricting your exports that may actually be something that you later import as a finished product. You will also face retaliation from other countries, and you might not actually be able to get some of the key ingredients or some of the components that you need for your goods. So in a way, you are hurting your production capacity, and so at the same time, you are disincentivizing scaling out production. So in a way, some of the learnings that we have from the crisis is that no country is too big or too technically developed to be able to face COVID-19 on their own, to face this kind of pandemic. And this is a good thing. Why is that a good thing? I believe it's a good thing because when you're facing something like COVID-19, it's a symmetric shock, and your factories will have to close. Many of your workers will not be able to go to work, and you will have to import more from abroad. We have seen that on data. So let me take the example of face masks. If you look at the number of intra-EU imports, so the amount of face masks that Spain imports from France, that Germany imports from the Netherlands, and so on and so forth, those imports increased by 45%, which is a very significant figure. But the number of imports of face masks from the EU, that the EU bought from outside the EU, went up by 700%. So these figures which we can show is that countries actually, their strategy was to tap into the manufacturing capacity of the rest of the world to get as many medical supplies as possible. It wasn't not to turn inwards, but more to turn outwards. And this kind of, let me take this, and I'm going to finish with the third point, which is, should countries relocate or not to relocate? Is the reshoring a good strategy? And let me kind of reiterate the starting point, is that it was quite surprising for many countries that found themselves unable to produce as many medical goods as they needed. But it was not, at least in the developed countries, let's say Europe, the US, Japan, and other countries with technical capacity to do it. It was not that they were unable to produce those goods, it's that they were not able to produce enough of those goods because the increase in demand was huge. And because many of these goods come from, particularly for personal protective equipment. So these are goggles, face masks, gowns you put for the medical staff not to be infected with COVID-19. Many of these goods come from China, are imported from China. And many countries found themselves that they needed these goods and they need them fast. So they found that since many of these goods come from China, if there was to be a political dispute with China, or if there was to be a natural disaster in China, they will not be able to get those goods. And then import diversification, the ability to import from different places, became a thing in order to build resilience for countries to withstand another crisis like COVID-19 or a natural disaster or something unexpected. But it's interesting that this call for import diversification has been interpreted by many countries as a call for reshoring. So getting some of this production capacity from Asia back to the US or Europe. And I think it's not necessarily a good idea. And I don't think it's a good idea because the ultimate objective of diversification is to being able to, when you have a shock like COVID-19, most of your production capacity will suffer. And we don't know how these shocks will come. We don't know in which shape or form, but we know that they will come, and when they come, they usually come at the same time in one place. They are symmetric shocks. And if you think about reshoring, it seems to be like the opposite of import diversification. It seems to be like more like putting all your eggs into one basket. So having said that, I'm going to finish my presentation with 3 graphs. These 3 graphs come from a paper my former colleague Florian Kurzhuber and I published recently. And one of the things we did in that paper was to look at EU imports from within the single market and EU imports from outside the EU. Then we look at 9,000 products and we order them by market share. And I'm going to highlight 2 things from this graph. The first one is that I'm going to actually concentrate on the things that are happening on the right side of the graph. So when you see the market share from 80 to 90 and 90 to 100, the purple vertical line are the imports that the EU gets from the EU countries. And the yellow bar is the imports that the EU gets from outside the EU. The first thing you can find is that the purple line on the 80 to 90, 90 to 100 is really high. It's right around 3,000 products, more than 3,000 products, like 35% of all the product categories that the EU imports. For those products, 80% of it come from within the EU. But still, there are around 400 products that the EU imports in its majority from outside the EU. Which are these products and from which countries? So these are 424 products, and 40% of those products come from China. But only 2% of the value of those 424 products imported into the EU from non-EU countries is value that are Chinese imports. Around 11% are imports from the US and 5% are imports from the UK, which means that relationships with the US and, to an extent, Brexit can be as important as dependency with China when you look at whether the EU is dependent on other countries. But for 73% of the products, non-EU countries have less than 50% of the market share. So we are talking about these 400 products, which might actually be an issue, but because for the large majority, non-EU countries get less than 50% of the total EU imports. And now I'm going to move to the third graph. Another way to look at it that we were exploring in the paper is market concentration. Market concentration is important because you don't want to be too dependent from a few suppliers. If something bad happens to those suppliers, you will not receive those imports, and it's likely that you will receive that economic shock will be transmitted to you. So in this graph, what we did was to look at all the EU member states, and then again, the purple line is the market concentration of EU imports for those countries. Then total imports is the yellow line, and the difference is the gray line. the best way, it doesn't really, you cannot really say it very nicely because the graph is too big. But the best way to understand this graph is to interpret the results for one country. So for example, for France, the 4 largest EU suppliers capture around 79% of all the imports. These are not the same countries all the time. These are different countries. The 4 largest suppliers, different countries and different products. When you look at total imports, the total imports that France makes from EU and non-EU countries, the market share of the 4 largest suppliers goes down to 65%. So in a way, what the imports from the rest of the world, what they do is they reduce the market concentration that EU countries have on each other. It diversifies in the sources of supply, reducing the vulnerability that something bad will happen to the neighbors and that they will not be able to get those supplies. And if you want to know, I'm sure you want to know, for the products for which the 4 largest suppliers were non-EU countries, there were only 112 products that happened. And the countries were China, the US, the UK, and the kind of products are products that do not grow in Europe, like coffee beans, also products like cotton or gas, and things like bicycle parts. Those are manufacturing. But these are only 112 products. It's really a minority. And this is my final slide. So not all the products are equally important when you're thinking about dependency, right? It might be that some products are very easy to substitute and other products are not essential if there is a pandemic or there is a real shock. So for that reason, we look at 118 products, a list of products that Eurostat, the statistical office of the European Union, prepare. And these are products that can be, so these are medicines, these are protective equipment, which are relevant for COVID-19. And we did a very similar analysis as in the previous slide. And what we found was that there was not a single COVID-19 related product for which a non-EU country captured more than 80% of the market share. And for every of these products, for every of the 118 products, the EU countries capture at least 20%. This is important because it kind of shows that the EU countries have the knowledge and the ability to produce many of the goods. When you look at the number of suppliers that the EU gets these products, there was not a single EU or non-EU country that was the only provider of any of these goods. In fact, these goods can have a kind of quite diversified sources of supply. On average, these 118 goods came from 46 different locations, and the product that came from the fewer number of countries was one product that came from 36 countries. So it kind of shows that the EU gets many of these products from different places. And now to conclude, if I were to kind of summarize my presentation and ask you to remember 3 things, I would say that the 3 things are that the first one is that there are products, that's true, for which the EU gets the majority of the imports from non-EU countries. But these are around 400 products. The second thing is that none of these products happen to be one of these 118 products that are essential for COVID-19. And the third point that I would like to put across is that if you really want to diversify your sources of supply to build your resilience for a pandemic like COVID-19, or it could be something like a plague or a natural disaster or a nuclear disaster, I think that's a very good, it's a good policy and should be looked at, but concentrating your production back into one location. It could be China, or it could be within the EU. It's not necessarily the good policy because it's very likely that when the shock happens, all your factories will have to close at the same time. Thank you.
Great, and we'll go to Annabelle next. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you very much for your presentation and for organizing this panel. I'm delighted to be here with you, with Anna and Lucian. So let me start. I'm probably going to build on some of the points that Oscar was making. So I want to leave 4 key messages with you, or so I thought, because they're not coming out in my presentation. So those 4 messages are basically the following. First is that the initial reactions to COVID-19 were mixed. Some of them went in one direction, some of them went in another direction. The second is that evidence so far also is pointing in different directions. The third one is that there are many uncertainties and risks that remain. And the fourth point is that initial policy responses should be reassessed and trade cooperation reignited to fight COVID-19 and prepare for future crises. So let me first start by saying that we know that COVID-19 shock to supply chains was multidimensional. On the one hand, there were forced reduction in production as a result of the containment measures, steep decline in demand in some sectors, such as automobile and textiles, and sharp increase in others, as personal protective equipment, as Oscar was mentioning, the severe maritime air and transportation disruptions, and unprecedented business uncertainty. So the key questions that policymakers were confronting, and I would say are still confronting in many places, are to fight the pandemic and save lives, how to provide timely and affordable access to personal protective equipment, to the respiratory support and monitoring equipment, to diagnostic tests and medicines. And here, what we have seen is that, as Oscar was explaining, governments rushed to curb exports of medical gear and some of them also on foodstuff, but also to facilitate trade. Actually, the joint project by the Global Trade Alert, the World Bank, and the European University Institute found that by September 4th this year, a total of 660 trade policy interventions in essential goods sectors had been documented, and 2/3 of them were in the medical goods sector and 1/3 in the food sector. And just over half of those interventions, that is 328 of them, restricted trade, whereas 332 liberalized trade. I think a little bit in that logic that Oscar was saying, first let's try to get everything we can, and then let's not allow this goods to get out of our country. At the same time, while this dynamic on exports and imports was playing out, there were calls to reshore production and reconfigure global value chains. In a way, deepening some pre-pandemic trends. This was already happening to a certain degree before the pandemic. And this, of course, in the context of heightened trade tensions. So I'm going to share with you, Oscar shared with us, I think, some very interesting evidence on what actually happened. And I'm going to share with you some additional information that comes from a report published by the WTO just some 10 days ago. In this report, the WTO finds some interesting points. First, the initial shortages of medical PPE have eased because production and trade have expanded to meet the unparalleled demand spike. Second, trade in medical goods grew by almost 40% in the first half of 2020. There are certainly, for sure, some specific products that remain subject to shortages, and sourcing is still a challenge for many developing countries. Some political commitments have been made to keep markets open. Members are sharing information to a greater or lesser extent with the WTO about their COVID-19 trade measures. Duties, taxes, and charges on COVID-19 critical medical goods and other essential supplies have been temporarily removed or deferred by some 40 members. Additionally, additionally, countries have taken other measures, including customs procedures and border clearance for COVID-19 critical medical goods have been expedited by cutting back red tape. Steps have also been taken to enhance regulatory approval and cooperation on standards for traded goods, for example, in the case of the EU. Measures related to IPR are being used to facilitate innovation in and access to COVID-19 related technologies. And also critical medical services, access to critical medical services has been expedited by some members. Some governments have also notified expedited procurement procedures. So this, I think, are all good news. As part of this good news, we've also seen that evidence is pointing that goods trade may be rebounding, and that some of the worst case scenarios that were projected in April may be averted. But also, evidence also shows that we know that there are massive support programs that are being put in place to address the economic dimensions of the pandemic. And these, are important and are well merited, but some of them may benefit exporters, and this may introduce distortions to trade. And I will come back to this. Now, so the evidence is, positive on the one hand on what has happened, but also mixed on what has happened in another fronts. But there are also many uncertainties and risks that remain. So one of those uncertainties is what will happen to vaccines. My colleague at the Peterson Chat Bound produced a paper recently on the tragedy of vaccine nationalism that addresses precisely this point. On the uncertainties, we see this proliferation of national programs to alter firms' location decisions and reconfigure supply chains. And we see them in most advanced countries. Here are some clips from newspapers that show this. Case of Japan, for instance, started paying firms to cut reliance on Chinese factories. All sorts of bills, for instance, in the case of the US as well, in many different places. And not only countries taking individual policy measures themselves to try to do this, but also trying to forge alliances to relocate production out of China. So, for instance, a recent alliance between Japan, India, and Australia. The US also has a similar alliance that they're trying to put in place, and others. Of course, part of the uncertainties and risks is the results of the U.S. election and the global impact that these results could have. So, in light of what we know and of what we don't know, then the question is, what should be the midterm response to the pandemic? Should it be more cooperation or actually more deglobalization? And in this context, multinationals are rethinking their supply chain strategies. And they're doing so basically to answer two key questions. One is how to improve risk management in supply chain systems that have been focused mostly on optimization with little flexibility to absorb the disruptions, be it a pandemic, but earthquake or hurricane or others. And how to protect against the vulnerability implicit in very long supply chains or production networks that are highly concentrated. And here, interestingly enough, there are different alternatives that are being discussed in the context of firms, but most important also in the policymaking realm. And Oscar was referring, for instance, to reshoring, which from the perspective of risk management is not a good strategy as it concentrates production in one location. From the perspective of risk management, the risk is as important as if the production site is located abroad or if it's located at home. Then other strategies that are being considered include the diversification of production location and sourcing. And that very much depends on the nature of the industry. For some industries, it may make sense. For instance, labor-intensive industries may be more mobile than resource-intensive value chains. Nearshoring may be a cost-effective way of shortening supply chains and improve risk management. We've seen, for example, that Mexico has been sort of deepening a trend in terms of bringing in more foreign investment as part of this reconfiguration. We've seen also increased regionalization. But still, one important point that I want to make is that fundamentals dictate that our other supply chains will just remain global. And I think that we will see this in the context of some of this medical goods. Now, in thinking about strengthening the robustness and the resilience of global value chains, Other measures are important, and firms are also looking at this, including increased transparency and digitalization of supply chains. And I want to share with you a quote that I heard to John Denton, the president of the International Chamber of Commerce, because people frequently speak about the pandemic being a black swan event. In his case, he says that the black swan event is not the pandemic because large firms, at least, have risk management plans, maybe not to the extent that they should have in the context of this pandemic in particular, but he says that the black swan event is rather the lack of global cooperation among governments. So in answering this question, I think that there are a few points to bear in mind. One is that the facts, as Oscar was showing before, are beginning to show a different story on the role of supply chains and trade in providing affordable and timely access to medical goods and medicines. In light of these findings, it may be important to reassess some of the policy responses. But of course, here there is a risk that trade frictions and geopolitical rivalry may cloud the judgment in the best of circumstances, or that the alternative narrative will actually be leveraged to try to redraw the map of supply chains based on those geopolitical considerations. So this is why I think that unless concerted action is taken to reignite trade cooperation, things could take a turn for the worse. And we could see growing protectionism, increased distortions and disruptions to global value chains, or maybe even spillover effects into other realms. So to conclude, just very briefly, and we can discuss further about this, I think that the way to go about global trade cooperation to fight the pandemic in particular is to look at the why, the how, the what, the where, and the when. The why is because we need to fight the pandemic and reignite growth. We need to avoid politically appealing, self-sufficient, or self-defeating trade policies. Important to reverse some of the damaging measures because some of those measures have been either expired or have been removed, but others are still in place. We need to think about enhanced trade frameworks for managing crisis because we have COVID-19, but other crises will come as well. And we also need to look at the dramatic changes brought about by the pandemic and also to think about some of the old problems. So global cooperation is ideal, but if it's impossible, then willing countries should step up, and we have seen that happening. Some of the issues to consider include the standstill and rollback of current export bans that are still standing and the restrictions on new measures, maybe an agreement on health-related products, maybe a common framework on cross-border movement of health professionals, and certainly collective understanding on access to new vaccines and drugs. And the WTO, for all its challenges, is a natural forum to bring this conversations to, but things need to change, including with increased transparency and improved operational practices. And the last point that I want to make is that, of course, COVID-19 does not wait. By the time I prepared this presentation, last week there were 30 million cases and counting. Today, I saw that there are 33 million cases already. So there's basically no time to lose. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We'll go to Lucian next, but I just wanted to invite the audience members to submit questions. We have plenty of time. We'd love to have a lively discussion here, so please put your questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. As I said in the chat, I was very pleased to see some of my old friends from Geneva being here in the audience and also from Brussels, from around the world. So I'm very happy to see that our session has attracted a lot of attention. And I think the best way to start my presentation is to find my first slide in order to share with you the few things that I prepared for today. In principle, I wanted to basically cover a few important things. First, we will have to look at the pre-COVID pandemic, and then we will have to look at the actual COVID measures, but also perhaps to bring in, beyond reshoring and resilience, two very prominent words these days. We also have to think of technology in the longer term. So I will zoom in between a bit of the present, maybe a bit of the past. We will zoom into the COVID specific areas, but then we will zoom out again to the wider issues that we may have in global supply chains in general, beyond COVID, also because with COVID or without COVID, there will be very important disruptive technological changes that would probably change the way we think about global supply chains. I would also like to indicate very clearly from the outset that I have an institutional disclaimer, so the views expressed here are personal and do not reflect an official position of the European Commission. Now, let me start with the big picture and the kind of the pre-COVID common understanding of the world trading system. We all, probably all in the audience, were familiar with the fact that most of the products were not really made in one country, but most of the products were actually made in the world, which is a think tank that the WTO tried to publicize for several years. So I think in a nutshell, if I were to describe the world of international trade prior to COVID, I would have said that it is actually not dominated by the US, it's certainly not dominated by China, it's actually dominated by global value chains. World trade is dominated by global value chains. Therefore, being part of our DNA, global value chains will actually persist and survive even a pandemic. I could even go to make a little parallel with our initial beginnings as species on Earth, since I wrote a nice paper with Oscar a couple of years ago about the importance of trade in actually in making us what we are today, the dominant species, the Homo sapiens on Earth. There is archaeological evidence showing that, in fact, global value chains started in the Stone Age. And unlike the Neanderthals, Homo sapiens were at their own level engaging in global supply chains. They were engaging in long-distance trade of what was at the time probably called critical supplies. People thought that probably stones and ivory and many other sharp objects were critical supplies. Of course, they didn't have these sophisticated acronyms. They didn't talk about the strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy, but they probably thought in their own way, the Neanderthals in a very isolationist way and Homo sapiens in a very cooperative way. They thought that they have to probably find the best way to survive. And it turned out that Homo sapiens had the right solution. Cooperation and trade was better than being isolated in your little community. Now, zoom again, fast forward back to the present. As I said, you see here the iconic US product, the Boeing. You can see that many of these essential parts of a very complicated product are actually sourced around the world. And what makes a product like this successful are many issues. In fact, is the fact that Boeing decided to choose suppliers from the best in their industry. It doesn't matter where they are actually located. Boeing also decided to actually make standards compatible with many other elements so that pieces fit together. And at the end of the day, your plane can land anywhere in the world, hopefully safely. So these are the kind of things that we took for granted for a very long time, and rightly so. But then COVID came along, and some people had a number of, well, partly probably legitimate questions. Here I wanted to show a picture, and probably the other disclaimer that Anna, you should have told the audience is that this is a session full of economists, and they will probably throw many figures and charts at you, so bear with us for a few more minutes. But what I wanted to show with this chart is that even for a continent like the European Union, which is well known for its ability to supply a lot of sophisticated products, including in the medical sphere that we're all interested in nowadays in the COVID world. As you can see here, very important producers, take Germany, but more specifically Spain or Italy, they depend to a very large extent on COVID testing products from many countries, notably from the United States. So no country can actually hope to have a self-sufficient, successful strategy. In fact, self-sufficient is not even an option for an entire continent. And I stole this citation information from my Director General, who used it recently in an event in the United States. But it's absolutely true. If you want to look at the data, you could actually see, and Oscar actually presented a lot more data to substantiate this claim. So it's important for us to realize that if we want to have a successful trade-related COVID strategy, we need not to look at reshoring or nearshoring or whether we have too much, I would say, exposure to a particular complex supply chain. It's not about complexity. At the end of the day, if you are really concerned about your GVC vulnerability, it's all about concentration and dependency on a few global suppliers. This is the essential thing, at least at the first level, that you should address. And Oscar and I did another paper recently where we tried to do again, and I will take only 1 minute to explain this complicated chart to you, which has 3 elements. On the x-axis, we have the number of suppliers. So the further you go to the right, the more diversified you are, the better it is. On the y-axis, on the vertical axis, you have the number of products that we import. So essentially, we import roughly 9,000 products in the EU. And then the size of the bubble is the size of trade in those products. So the question is, how concentrated our global supply chains are? So if you take a look at the little bubble on the top left-hand corner, the 260 or so, 250 products, these are the most vulnerable products. Why are they vulnerable? Well, because according to the data, they are actually imported from a single source. So they are really on the most, I would say, vulnerable in a way, because we don't have a plan B. These products are imported by many companies in Europe, and they don't have a plan B if, for whatever reason, the supplier cannot supply in the right quantities and the right time. But the further away you go to the right, the more you have a diversified supply chain environment. And the green line is very important because it separates the 9,000 products into 2 parts. The ones to the left are those that are imported from less than 25 suppliers. But 25 suppliers is still a generous number of suppliers, I would say. And all the others, you can see all the other products to the right, they are supplied by more than 25 suppliers. In fact, the largest share of our trade, 11% of our total trade, this is the biggest bubble just to illustrate with values, the biggest chunk of our trade is actually imported from more than 60 suppliers. Well, I would call that a very diversified source of our supplies. But let's not be foolish. Let's probably be cautious and use the precautionary principle. We cannot rule out that some global value chains may be vulnerable. So it means that public policy measures may be necessary to anticipate vulnerabilities. But for that, we need something that we don't really have in place. We would need the right data, the right transparency, the right metrics to measure vulnerability. The best way to measure vulnerability in an ideal world would be to have firm-level trade data. The data exists, but is not readily available. I mean, neither me nor Oscar, and I'm a public official in the European Commission, I don't have access to firm-level data. So if I wanted to equip myself with the best policy tool to monitor GVC vulnerability, I don't have that data. Whereas the data nonetheless exists in member states, in some parts of our administration, you will find this data, except that we did not connect all these dots yet. So hence, one of our current thinking process is how to create a platform, a monitoring platform of GVCs, of global value chains, that will allow ourselves to take the right measures whenever necessary and not take the wrong measures whenever they are not necessary. And one of the new, again, it's one of the red thread I wanted to use throughout my paper, in my presentation, we also need to avail ourselves of the latest technologies. And the latest technology that may be very useful for Corona, but also beyond Corona, is blockchain. So our latest initiative, on which I think I might have another ECIPE blog very soon, is on the latest project that we launched in Digitrade, which is called EU Blockchain for Trade. And that will allow ourselves to perhaps equip the policymakers with a very solid, very robust monitoring tool to take the right decisions. Now, going back again to COVID, this is the last slide on COVID, and then we zoom out again to the big picture of all the 9,000 products, global supply chains, and the future. But to stay for 1 more minute on COVID, I think as Annabelle said, and Oscar as well, Perhaps we need to make sure that two important pillars are important in everything we do. A coordinated response is probably the most important thing, and also important the use of new technologies that empower us as a society, as a progressive society, to actually protect ourselves. So a couple of examples from the European policy toolbox that we took recently, where you clearly see the benefits of coordinated response. We have launched the EU joint procurement strategy so that different hospitals or different member states do not compete for the same supplies, bringing prices up. We had these joint procurement in order to optimize the public cost and to ensure that we don't compete for scarce resources. We have optimal allocation of COVID-related products. We also have a common EU vaccine strategy. We actually signed this pre-development contracts with many companies that are front runner in that race for having a vaccine. We also realized that at least in the short term, reshoring is not possible, and as we heard, it's probably not the best idea. But stockpiling is necessary, at least in the first few weeks of a crisis. We stockpile oil in case there's an oil shortage. Why shouldn't we also think about stockpiling masks or other things, which again, we should mutualize our stockpiling instead of having multiplication of stockpiles, which will never be sufficient. And then we'll have to worry who has what, how can we actually exchange them. So this new initiative, Rescue, has this joint stockpiling rapid deployment initiative. I could go on and on because there are many European initiatives. I can hardly keep up with them. But I think it's also important to also mention that we are not just working as an isolated continent. We are actually very keen to promote global coordination. Two examples in this area. We have actually made available a line of credit for those most fragile economies who have been hard hit by the corona crisis, economically speaking. So this post-COVID recovery and the sustainable development goals are actually supported from our limited ability with, I think, a very important sum that is made available for the least developed countries in particular and the most fragile economies. Equally important now on the health side is that we have made a commitment to make available to the world's poorest countries around 250 million vaccines whenever we get them. So it's not about us having a vaccine nationalism. Of course, we would like to work together with others, but the moment we have a vaccine, it's also important to make sure that the most fragile and the most disenfranchised citizens who are probably equally affected, they would be entitled to the right to have a vaccine. And now that brings me to the transition to the bigger picture, but I think it's important to understand the role of technologies even in this COVID pandemic. We all know about the app tracing, this digital tools that will allow us to see whether social distancing and contacts, if someone gets infected, who else was in contact with that person. But these are the kind of things we see in the newspapers. What we don't see in the newspaper is that technology plays a far bigger role. For instance, we made a number of European standards that are critical for newcomers in this COVID supply world to actually be able to see those standards and start producing from scratch, but up to standards. You can be a company that was doing something slightly similar, but you don't have the capacity and the expertise to do COVID-related materials. You need to learn about the standards. We made them free for you. We also wanted to allow the latest technologies, which were proven to be extremely important when transport went down, because one of the problems with supply chains is that transport logistics, because of social distancing, because of all this lockdown, they actually broke down at some point. In which case, in order for you to have that spare part or one element that is missing in your supply chain, you actually had to use 3D printing, which is a very promising technology. Well, for 3D printing, we also need standards that are safe, particularly in this case. So that brings me to, again, to the big picture. Let's step out of COVID and think about supply chains more generally. And let's think about technology and use 3D printing as an example, because there are many other technologies, not just 3D printing. But I think one lesson from the corona crisis that will apply throughout the global supply chains of the world is that we cannot simply think of them as global. I think we will probably gradually move towards a hybrid supply chain set of platform. Efficiency is no longer enough. So far, companies distributed their supply capacities in order to maximize profits and make it the most efficient possible, which is absolutely normal for any company. But now I think that's no longer enough. Proximity is going to be important. Stability is also going to be important. And that will actually naturally create this risk mitigation strategy that Annabelle mentioned. Companies will naturally like to be to have their supply chain resilient. And that's one of the things that we discussed also with Oscar in our ECIPE paper on ants and dinosaurs. Resilience is very important, not just for policymakers, it's important for companies. Of course, many GVCs will remain as they are because you require raw materials, you require certain labor skills and cost, etc. But let's not forget that technology is just in front of us. Companies have innovated a lot in the last decade, something that policymakers probably didn't do enough to catch up with those. So we have now robotics, we have 3D printing, we have servicification. So here's a chart about the exponential increase of 3D printing activities. You can see that it went from close to nothing to a multi-billion, probably in the end, in 10 years from now, multi-billion industry. What's interesting about 3D printing is that the vast majority of activity and profits and action in this niche activity yet is actually in services. So 3D printing will actually change the way global supply chains will work, but also the role between and this fine balance between goods and services. So I have here a very complicated chart, but I'll try my best to just summarize it in some very important messages. Look first at where it says today, because this is where we are today. So this is the fundamental balance between goods and services in global supply chains today. Very few people know that in reality, and this is the fault of statisticians, but very few people know that in reality, currently the trading goods, it's smaller than trading services. You see many respectable papers where the opposite is claimed, that trading services is probably a quarter of trading goods, people would say. Why do they say that? Because they ignore, and rightly so, because statistics are not fully available and probably not entirely comparable, this mode 3, what I call mode 3, which is investment. So nowadays we rely a lot for global supply chain on foreign direct investment, particularly in services. And when you add all this for the people interested in the GATT jargon, these are all the 4 modes of supply that services use to be traded internationally. If you add them up, you will see that the value of trading services is already bigger than the value in goods. That's message number 1. Now, zooming into that part that says goods. Now, goods nowadays are no longer just goods. Goods are a combination, a bundle of goods and services. And we can measure the part of a good that is actually a service in a box. And that's what I call mode 5, and gradually others as well. So if you actually add this, you will see that goods and services need each other in order to have functioning global supply chains. Now, fast forward a little bit and look at tomorrow. If tomorrow we are going to live in a world where robotics, Internet of Things, and 3D printing will be dominant, well, I think that what is going to happen is that trading goods will shrink even more so. We'll have a lot more digital services because digitalization, it's a phenomena that will be amplified by 3D printing. You no longer have to ship your product, you ship your design via email. There's a local printer that will only need some inks. Maybe those inks will be metallic powders or ceramic powder, and you print the product next to the consumer. So you no longer need to trade in intermediate products. You no longer need to invest abroad. You just need to have a trade in printers, trade in inks, and trade in design. There will be 3 fundamental comparative advantages that countries will have to have. Either you're good at making printers, either you're good at raw materials and the inks, or you're good at design. So what does that mean for trade policy making? My last slide. Well, as I tried to make this conjecture already, these are all conjectures, by the way. I don't have hard data to prove it. It's just me trying to anticipate things, and economists are not always good at forecasting, but here we go. So I think that in a way, because of this pressure on intermediate goods from many corners, including from climate change and other important policy objectives, there is a direction towards a reduction in trading goods, particularly the ones that can be produced locally. Not because we want to buy local, because technology will make it more efficient. So if trading goods will decline, so will the importance of the GATT rules, which are very important for many people nowadays. What will increase, in fact, is trading inks. These are very important raw materials. They will become even more disaggregated, even more diversified. So there will be a very huge market for trading inks. And countries with raw materials will have yet another go at boosting their comparative advantage. Because we'll trade a bit less in goods, trade will become overall greener, which is something we've been all trying to do now, because trade is not always green. There's not the most important contributor to climate change, but I don't think it has a net neutral or net zero or negative contribution. So there's a lot that we could do to make trade greener. Now, services, as I said, will increase as well. And so the importance of some modes of supply, I already tried to describe to you that digitalization will be the most important mode, but also mode 5, which is one area where trading goods and services come together in a very symbiotic way. And unfortunately, trade rules are still like men from Mars and women from Venus. There is really no bridge between the GATT and the GATS in the global architecture, and that makes it very difficult for some companies to operate efficiently. And then this is something that we probably all agree that intangibles are the new oil. It's not about trading stone and ivory and all these other things that our Homo sapiens ancestors thought is critical. Now I think data is a critical ingredient to our competitiveness. And again, if we are going to move towards this world where global supply chain will become hybrid supply chains, where trade will be fundamentally altered in many ways, perhaps also the trade and jobs equation will be altered. In Europe, for instance, nowadays we have 36 million jobs which are supported by trade. If I were to continue to monitor this equation and see in 10 years if we still have 36 million jobs, probably it will be 40, but trade will increase far at a greater pace than the number of the job intensity. So there will be probably people and policies that are necessary to ensure that this redistribution effect of trade policy and the need for safety nets actually is going to increase, because there will be less job intensity in trade if all these technologies will pan out as I tried to explain. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. We do have one audience question to start. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'd love to have audience participation. I do have questions of my own, but we definitely like to hear yours. This question came in response to Oscar's presentation, so perhaps we could start with him. But the question is, if reshoring or flight from China back to domestic manufacturing could be harmful, is production likely to move to Africa or India or be reorganized into stronger regional networks? And just to broaden that out a little bit for the other panelists as well, to what extent do you think the reshoring drives that you mentioned in the US and Japan and elsewhere will actually succeed in relocating supply chains out of China? There is a lot of growing skepticism about ties with China around the world, but China has also recovered very quickly from the coronavirus pandemic and still seems well positioned as the world's factory. And in fact, we saw Chinese exports soar in July to their second highest level ever. So is it better in general to say that global supply chains here are retrenching or reorganizing, or are they mostly resilient for now? But again, the audience question about reshoring from China leading to production moving to Africa or India or being reorganized into stronger regional supply networks. Thanks.
Should I go first, Anna? Okay. So if I understood well, the first question was whether the production from China is going to go to other places like Africa or Latin America or elsewhere. I don't know. I honestly don't know. And I think that's important. It's important to recognize that policymakers or governments do not produce stuff. Companies do. And in a way, when countries are tinkering with this economic specialization that has been going on since many years ago, you might have the issues of, changing your comparative advantage and maybe making companies produce something at home that they were not good producing it before, and that will be more expensive. And it could also be that you are putting all these restrictions on companies, and companies will decide to sell you those goods, and it will be at a higher price. So I'm a bit skeptical about the ability of governments, and I think that's answering more your second question, of the ability of governments to actually attract some of these some of these companies back. So I think in France there is 1 billion put aside to attract reshoring, relocation, and I think Italy as well is looking at some tax incentives to attract businesses producing in Asia to produce in Italy. I'm sure there are other schemes elsewhere. So I think I'm rather skeptical about the ability of governments to actually do that, and at the same time, they might actually lay down to producing goods that are more expensive. On whether we can, so I'm actually honestly in favor of free trade, and trade I think is a good thing. So diversifying your production from, if you're concentrating your production in China and diversify your sources of supply, I think it's also a good thing. And it's even a better thing if those companies are small and medium enterprises, because then you have more suppliers, and if something bad happened to one, you have others to get your sources. So in a way, I think this could be an opportunity for companies in other locations to get into the value chains and start producing some of these goods. But on the other hand, this is probably more up to, as Annabelle was saying, multinational corporations and supply chains and their decisions, rather than governments, which might have a limited ability to nudge multinationals in certain directions.
So maybe let me also say a couple of words. I think that we know that supply chains are mostly driven by fundamentals. We're talking about endowments, geography, markets, institutions. And this has been the case before, and there's nothing to think, no reason to think why this will not change in the future. Having said this, it is true that this can be impacted both by technology and by policies. And actually, we are seeing, even before the pandemic, that some of the technologies that Lucian was referring to had determined that it would make maybe more sense to produce a good in a different place where it was being assembled, for example, by using new technology. So that's a possibility. Policies, of course, can also have an impact on firms' location decisions or sourcing decisions, but up to a certain point, because if policies go very much against fundamentals, then they become very expensive policies. And these are some of the things that we're seeing right now. For instance, governments that are putting out incentives to try to bring production home, or simply move production out of China, they find out that they're having to give some handouts to firms, such as, for instance, what the Japanese government is doing. Evident that firms want to move. One reason being because China a huge market, and it is also in the interest of firms to be there. So there are a number of surveys that have been made. One important one that comes to mind is one that was done by the U.S. American Chamber of Commerce in China that asked firms, have they been thinking about moving production out of China? Or they've been thinking about changing suppliers and looking for suppliers elsewhere. And there was a large number, some 84% of firms that said basically that they were not thinking about moving their production, and some over 70% said that they were not thinking about changing suppliers. So some firms are also talking about maybe have a China +1 or China +2 initiative, because they don't want to be concentrated in one particular country. And that, I think that point is one that that we will see more and more about this. So it's not that easy to move supply chains around. There are countries that, for specific reasons, again, most of them associated with the fundamentals, are well placed to continue to see increased foreign direct investment. Think again about Mexico. Geography works in Mexico's favor because it's very easily the U.S. market. Think about Vietnam, for example. Low labor costs in Vietnam are a very strong element of comparative advantage. So in as much as we can see those in other parts of the world, they will be able to attract foreign direct investment. Or if we see policies that are conducive to strengthening some of the elements of comparative advantage, or actually, for instance, reducing trade costs. If you think about Ethiopia, Ethiopia has been very successful, for instance, in attracting apparel. Now it's suffering because of the context of COVID-19. But it is only natural that it will continue to be an attractive location if again the policies that are put in place are the right set of policies to support GDC integration. So it's not as easy as governments to dictate changes in supply chains. Now, there is a tendency in most advanced countries, certainly in the US, to look at supply chains in medical goods and medicines in general, a bit in this light of critical supply chains, more around the lines of, some defense, the thinking around defense, or the thinking about some key infrastructure, and to a certain extent, in some places, also the thinking around food supply chains. But we'll see where that goes. Just recently, for instance, important manufacturing associations in this area were providing testimony to Congress saying, no, we're not interested in reshoring. That would make it impossible for us to produce what we need to produce, or it would make it so expensive that no one would be able to buy it. So I think after all this hype, we will see there's a potential for war to calm down, to rethink supply chains, but more around how to improve resilience, how to improve trust, what role for digitization, what role for transparency, and aspects like this.
Great. And Lucian, did you have any thoughts about this question? I also have some specific questions about your presentation.
Well, maybe my specific question will be very difficult, so I'd rather spend time on this one. So, no, I just very quickly, I would recommend to those colleagues interested in the potential for sort of a market-driven mechanism for diversification and reduction of risks and concentrated supply chains. There is a very nice paper in the VoxEU universe of COVID-related materials where the chief economist of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, identifies on the basis of comparative advantage kind of a way. It's a market-driven sort of mechanism. A bank has to make money out of their loans, but they said, look, if we were to play a useful role ourselves with our loans in developing some economies in our portfolio and also contributing to a diversified supply chain and COVID resilience, they said, well, for instance, Morocco could do more fertilizers, Kazakhstan can do ferroalloys, Hungary, Poland, Romania could do car parts, Turkey could do more clothing, and Bulgaria, Egypt, or Morocco can do wires and cables. And why is that so? Because they are very close to the most competitive producer in the world, be it China or Vietnam. But now if you want to have proximity and diversification and a few other things that maybe are well justified, you will take that into account in your strategy as a company, and the banks and the European Investment Bank or the EBRD or the World Bank probably will allow this initial investment cost to be bridged by a loan. So I'm not preaching state interventionism in bringing supply chains at home, and I hope I didn't mention too many European member states. I mentioned countries who probably can be legitimately so because of their economic advantage, better integrated. We support that. But there is a potential, except that you should really have a very market-based approach to things and not be guided by my country first.
Great. Okay. Well, now I will ask you several difficult questions about your own presentation. So we actually had 3 audience questions in response to your presentation, and the first 2 I'll group together. One audience member says, I'm interested in Lucian's presentation on Trade Policy 2.0 and the setting up of a firm level monitoring platform. Is that something we could even think for other regions like Africa? What are the initial steps to move toward Trade Policy 2.0? There's another sort of related question here. The trends on digital services trade will be pursued in different ways according to different starting points. Gaps may increase among some countries. What opportunities and risks exist for multilateralism in the context of these trends? So slightly different, but first, is this trade policy 2.0 something we'll think about for other regions like Africa? And then what opportunities and risks exist for multilateralism?
Yes, well, thank you, Anna. Well, I mean, I don't know enough about all the countries or the particular country that would be interested in moving towards a firm level trade policy making. What I know for a fact is that in order for custom authorities to function, those custom officials will actually generate the kind of firm level data that I was advocating we should use more often for monitoring and transparency and policy making. So the short answer is most of the time, if you have an electronic custom system and if you try to create bridges between different ministries, you are in a very good position to think about a trade policy 2.0 platform. In fact, a particular country may be much better placed than 27 countries to start such a platform, because in the case of the EU, this customs data is collected in each and every member state. We need to have all the ducks aligned in order for the data to be shared with confidence in a European platform. So we have our own challenges, one being, and perhaps it's a common challenge for any country, to allow this firm level data, which is collected by custom authorities, to be anonymized, because I certainly do not need to know the name of a firm that is the sole supplier for a critical product in Europe. I need to know that there is only one firm. So my policy objective would be to make sure that we have more than one firm, and we will try to look at alternative suppliers, or probably to encourage mitigating measures. So what is confidential in the data is the name of the firm, and that should not be part of any monitoring tool. But the actual metadata, how many suppliers do you have for each and every product, particularly the critical ones. You have to define your set of critical products, and then you narrow down the issue to a manageable problem. We're probably be talking about a few hundred products for which anonymized data will be fed from one public administration department to another. It's very important to actually allow public data to be reused for policy making. I think, as far as I remember, the 9/11, the tragedy of 9/11 apparently could have been avoided if in the US system data would have been shared among different departments. And that in itself speaks volumes about the possibility for us as policymakers to put in place the best policy response with very limited cost. We won't need anything in addition to what we already have. We just need to make better use of what we have. Now, going to the second question, could you please remind me the exact focus of the question? So multilateralism in relation to what exactly?
That's right. So the trends on digital services trade will be pursued in different ways according to different starting points. Gaps may increase among some countries. What opportunities and risks exist for multilateralism in the context of these trends? And actually, maybe I could just throw in the third question here, because the third question is about whether this there should be a formal introduction of Mode 5 into the WTO GATS framework. So you talked about the increasing importance of Mode 5 services supply. Do you think of formally introducing this into the WTO GATS framework would have benefits, or could the value of services embodied in goods be incorporated by the other four modes? So multilateralism and the role in the WTO.
Right. Well, the importance of the digital trade, of course, is going to create lots of opportunities, and countries will position themselves in this new equation in different places. The fundamental logic of international trade, that we will specialize in what we can do best, will probably remain as true as before. I was trying very crudely to explain that in a digitalized supply chain where a lot of these new technologies will be in place, if you simplify a lot that equation, you can remain competitive even though you're not the master of the data. You're not the one that will have all these feedback loops that will make a product smart and personalized. You can probably be the one that will provide these raw materials, which are going to be the new inks. The new oil will be the kind of materials that 3D printing would require. And frankly, these would be best done close to those countries that have the raw materials. So they have a great potential in moving up from just pure mining or just harvesting some elements into adding the next layer, which will make this advanced materials. We're talking about advanced materials that can actually become, from powder, they become stronger than steel. And that kind of advanced materials require raw kind of very important ingredients that developing countries, very poor countries, have in abundance. So their challenge and their opportunity is to actually move up the ladder, not to become the new Silicon Valley, but to become the new, what should I say, the new Gulf region where it comes to the most important raw material of the world. And there will be many. That's the other thing about 3D printing. Unlike oil, we'll have a diversity of needs. It's plastic, it's ceramic, it's steel. So this is the next level for a very poor country that what has natural endowments. Then you can be a labor-intensive country, and then maybe you have enough technology to create the printers or the robotics. I mean, the robots, sometimes they build by themselves, but sometimes you still need a bit of a labor to ensure that they are functioning correctly. So for some countries in the middle of the developing curve, that's where they will still be. They will do the industrial side of the new GVCs, and they're already there. And for countries that are very advanced in their design and research and development, they will do the design, the testing, the kind of conceptualizing all these new supply chains, and will be like design in California but assembled in China. That logic will still be perhaps true in many respects. So what role for the WTO in that equation? Well, some rules of the WTO are very well equipped to deal with these technological disruptions, but others are not. And that gives me the perfect opportunity to answer the other question about Mode 5, because this is the one that I've been talking for a while, that there is a real gap in our trade rule book, a gap that companies have bridged decades ago, and they use it on a daily basis. So in order for a product to travel around supply chains, typically, unfortunately, they still pay duties every now and then. But Mode 5 is a service that, as a service, is not supposed to pay duties, but when it's trapped into a product, it pays duties. Now, in order for us to have this V-shaped recovery that Annabelle somewhat optimistically showed for the last month, that we're kind of bouncing back after a historical dip in trade, a double-digit reduction in trade, every single new initiative that will liberalize trade would be helpful. And I've wrote a few papers where I've shown that a Mode 5 initiative where these embedded services will no longer pay duties, we have a moratorium on the trade of the future. You know, what makes a product smart is technology. Now, at the moment, we inflict tariffs on technology. If we have a moratorium, at least for a few years, until we get back in shape on this most important part of trade and technology, that would be clearly an initiative that I think many members would be interested to discuss in this, the modernization of the WTO.
Okay, great. I just want to go back to some of the broader themes that we were discussing earlier with trade in medical supplies and other trade barriers that we saw come up during the pandemic. One issue we haven't discussed very much is the varying fortunes here of large countries versus small countries. So I wondered if you could just address what is happening to smaller countries in some of these contests, and what is the role of the WTO or other international institutions. It might also be interesting to look a little bit forward here to the example of vaccine production. I know one of you mentioned 250 million doses of vaccine being made available for the poorest countries, but how do you see this, any tensions between larger or small countries playing out in that vaccine contest? And whoever would like to jump in, I know that was a surprise question, but. You could start with Annabelle or Oscar to give Lucian.
Yeah, let me say a few words. I think that we will see tensions on as it relates to access to a vaccine when ready, unless governments are able to agree on the rules of the game beforehand. And all governments may be interested in doing this, whether they are large or small, because at this stage, we don't know which vaccine is going to work. And we don't know where that vaccine will get manufactured. And even further, we don't know even if after using the vaccine, new alternatives will become and will be available and will be much better. So the this is why it would make sense to get an understanding on access to vaccines. Now, vaccines are complicated, and they involve not only, of course, complicated from the perspective of research and development, but moreover, in terms of manufacturing, they're only manufactured in a few countries around the world. And very importantly, depending on the type of vaccine, the transportation, the logistics and transportation part of it may become an important barrier to distribution, because some of these vaccines may require to be transported under very cold temperatures, under very low temperatures, up to 80 degrees, and not all countries have the infrastructure to be able to handle this. So in looking forward, timely and affordable access to a vaccine will be a challenge, I think, irrespective of a country's size, but more because of the other considerations that I mentioned. And this is why this is the right moment to try to move towards an understanding in this area, because all of us are on the same boat. Let me just add that at the end of the day, no country will be safe until all countries are safe. So there is a very strong rationale to support having the vaccines for all.
Great. Oscar, did you have any thoughts you could share on that?
Yes, if I can add to what Annabelle has said. In my presentation, I am guilty of having a European bias. The work I do is mainly about Europe. But if you look at the arguments I made in terms of why Europe should look at the rest of the world and tap into the rest of the world manufacturing capacity to face a pandemic, and no country is big enough, as Lucian has said that, Annabelle has also agreed. These arguments are even more acute and more tangible for small economies. For small economies, having self-sufficiency is not an option, and the cost of the production of those goods is very expensive. So for them, it's really those questions that I've been kind of posing in my presentation will be, yeah, we know that, and for them you can see that how many countries have reduced the tariffs on medical goods, and they have changed the regulations to be able to import at more ease the goods that are from the US, from Japan, or from Europe. And I think these are things that, in a way, in the WTO context, is a way of trying to bring ideas on how can we rebuy multilateral trade and make it more tangible as something good, things that can be delivered and benefits that can be delivered to people. I think this kind of an agreement that can deepen the agreement on pharmaceuticals, or going beyond some kind of secure the reduction of tariffs, or making trade easier in a way, will be a positive step in order to show that the multilateral trade system can deliver for people some tangible gains.
Great. And Lucian, did you have any thoughts on this question?
I'm bound to mention, and I think it's an important element that countries should, and colleagues who are probably, many of them are trade diplomats in Geneva that would otherwise talk to us after the end of the session over a coffee break. But unfortunately now, because of COVID, that coffee break, it's going to be virtual. But I would really like to submit to their attention the paper that we put forward, the non-paper we put forward on the 11th of June on this global health initiative. We, the European Union, together with other countries, in particular in the so-called Ottawa group, we wanted to use the WTO as a force for good in making sure that next time we have a pandemic, we're better prepared. And for small developing countries, WTO and international rules are the best friends, alongside the European Union, of course. So what did we suggest in that paper? We suggested that we would have a permanent elimination, for instance, on tariffs and import restriction and export restriction on critical supplies. I think it's also important to, and very, very important actually, for a small developing country that does not have its own supply capacity. We call for a clear definition of what is called now equitable share of the international supply of essential goods. So there is language in the WTO which would say that we all need to share critical supplies in a proportionate, equitable way, particularly with countries that have a huge pandemic and no supply capacity. We weren't perfect in the last crisis, and I think we should admit that. Nobody was perfect. But having rules in place that will allow us to avoid a knee-jerk reaction is what we suggested, and I hope that that paper gets the right consideration in the WTO.
Okay, fantastic. We just have a few minutes here. I just thought, one theme that has come up in my reporting, which we didn't address, is just the role of, kind of popular opinion, democracy, populism in this conversation. I realize you all are, economists, so really focused on the data. But, I've been really struck that in my reporting, there actually was kind of a lot of anger that I saw from people about the idea that the United States would have been exporting medical supplies to China right before it was demanded by our, health professionals and by everyday people. And so, it does seem like there is some domestic demand for some of these goods to be made closer to home. And I just wanted to ask, do you think that these are populist tensions that are likely to kind of continue and to influence policymakers? What role do, economists or policymakers have to how do they have to think about these kind of demands from constituents, even if they might not be the most kind of economically rational thing for the supply chain? Any final thoughts? We just have a couple minutes left.
So maybe a quick comment on my side. I think it's important to explain that trade is part of the solution and it's not part of the problem. When countries are very large, they may think that they are able to produce everything within a country. But we've heard, and you've written some great pieces explaining why this is not possible. For smaller countries, this is evident because they know that they are not able to produce the 500 parts that a ventilator needs. So to me, it's a question of presenting the evidence, explaining that, no, you cannot produce everything that you need. None of us can. So we need trade to be able to have access, timely and affordable access to that equipment or those goods that we need in the context of a pandemic. It's impossible to think that when you have a 40% spike in demand in a matter of weeks, that there's going to be manufacturing capacity that will be able to respond immediately. Unfortunately, there will be some delay, and that's where stockpiling may come in and what have you. But I think that in the absence of trade, the situation would have been much worse in many places around the world.
If I can add, I agree with what Annabelle was saying. I think it's part of this question is kind of, it relates to the nature of the shock. It's very unexpected. It's very difficult to plan for it. I mean, it's impossible to plan, and governments cannot plan as they plan for the educational budget or the capital investment. You need to build actually the systems that gives you that flexibility. When the shock comes, you can actually resist, or you have the resilience to continue your production. But in a way, I think it was kind of an understandable reaction, because we know that supply chains are very important in electronics, and we might have been surprised that they are also very important in medical goods and medical supplies. And Lucian was saying that maybe Homo sapiens have been trading. We have been trading for a very long time, and that probably is our comparative advantage against the Neanderthals. But I think there is also something on the evolution, on the evolutionary biology of our brains in terms of we taking care of our own, and that probably will need to break in terms of how our kind of understanding of how goods are made has to. It's different in terms of our understanding of you should to take care of the ones that are closer to you, but it probably is a matter of time. At the same time, I think one of the learnings from the pandemic is that you don't need to concentrate on efficiency all the time. You can actually build some slack, some buffers. And I think there is some kind of an agreement in terms of the strategic reserves that you can have in medical supplies. The case of Finland has been a good one in terms of they having those reserves for historical reasons and how they have actually managed to confront the crisis in a relatively successful way.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. So, yeah, it does seem like there is a tendency for kind of political scapegoating, especially in the US, but elsewhere of foreign countries. But policymakers really need to have the hard conversations with people and explain, how global value chains work, and economists like yourselves are really well positioned to help them. So thank you so much for the really insightful commentary. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. I hope you'll continue to join many more events this week. And thank you all.